Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, listeners. You know, we're always exploring the fascinating link between creativity and mental illness.
Right.
Sometimes it's controversial, sure,
Yeah.
but always fascinating. And today, we're going way back in time
Mm-hmm.
to the 19th century.
Ooh,
Yeah, to see how ideas about melancholia were developing.
interesting.
We'll be looking closely at From Melancholia to Depression, Disordered Mood in 19th Century Psychiatry by Åsa Jansson. And to really, I don't know, kick things off,
Yeah.
I found this really wild fact. So in the 1800s, get this, doctors thought they could actually diagnose melancholia just by looking at you.
Really?
Yeah. Like if you had dark hair, dark eyes, a certain complexion, they saw those as like signs
Yeah.
of melancholic disposition.
That's wild. It sounds crazy to us now, right?
Right.
But it really shows how much our understanding of mental illness has changed over time.
Absolutely. It's like
Yeah.
night and day.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating about this period that the book looks at, is that it was a time of really radical change in how mental illness was understood and how it was treated.
Right.
And we see the rise of what we call like these biomedical approaches, where the focus shifts to biological explanations for mental distress.
Okay, so they were moving away from the four humors
Right.
and black bile,
Exactly.
looking more at the body, the brain, the nervous system.
Yeah, exactly. And the book actually emphasizes how even the term biology itself, it took on its modern meaning during this era.
Interesting.
Jansen writes, the term biology itself was introduced around 1800, and the new science of life challenged vitalistic notions of life, Jansen 2016-12. It's a reminder that even the way we define life itself was undergoing a transformation.
Right.
And this had a direct impact on how melancholia was viewed.
So instead of seeing it as this spiritual imbalance or almost like a character flaw,
Right.
they started to see it as a problem with the body systems.
Precisely. And this led to some new theories about how emotions and mental states were connected to the physical workings of the nervous system.
Okay.
And one of the key concepts that emerges here is psychological reflex action.
Okay, wait. Psychological reflex action.
Yeah.
What is that? What were they talking about?
Yeah, so it's actually a pretty intuitive idea.
Okay.
Think about what happens when you touch something hot,
Okay. Yeah.
right? Like your hand pulls back
Immediately.
before you even consciously register the pain. That's a reflex.
Right.
It's this automatic response. Well, they applied this same logic to emotions, suggesting that some emotional reactions, especially negative ones, could be involuntary, triggered by stimuli without conscious thought.
So like an emotional knee-jerk reaction.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But wait a minute. If our emotions could just be triggered like that, doesn't that make us less in control of our feelings than we think we are?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really gets right to the heart of the debate that this theory sparked. You know, if emotions are reflexes, are we truly responsible for our feelings?
Right.
How does that impact our understanding of mental illness?
Right.
And these were questions that 19th century physicians were grappling with. And in many ways, we're still wrestling with these questions today.
Absolutely. Wow. I can see how this concept of psychological reflex action could really shake things up.
Yeah.
So how did this new way of thinking about emotions actually influence the diagnosis of melancholia? Were there any immediate changes?
You know, it wasn't like an overnight transformation, but this new understanding of the nervous system did start to change the conversation. The focus shifted from moral judgments
Right.
to a more scientific approach,
Okay.
looking for the roots of mental illness in the body.
So it became less about blaming the individual and more about understanding the underlying mechanisms.
Exactly. And this is where this concept of mental pain emerges as a way to describe emotional suffering, but using the language of physiology. So it was a way to bridge the gap between physical and emotional experiences.
So instead of talking about sadness or despair in abstract terms,
Right.
they started talking about mental pain as this tangible thing.
Yeah.
Something that could be studied and treated.
Exactly. And Jansen states that the idea of mental pain provided a way to conceptualize emotional suffering and explain a variety of phenomena in medical terms, Jansen 2016-61. So this shift toward medicalizing melancholia was a really significant step.
Yeah.
It helped legitimize it as a real illness and paved the way for new approaches to treatment. But it also raised new questions about how to classify and define this really complex condition.
So even with all these new scientific ideas, there was still a lot of debate and uncertainty around what melancholia was and how it fit into the bigger world of mental illness.
Absolutely. There was no single universally accepted definition. And physicians were grappling with whether it was a distinct disease or a subtype of other conditions like monomania.
Hold on, monomania, remind me what that is.
Right, so monomania was basically like an obsession with a single idea or delusion.
Okay.
And some physicians believed that melancholia could manifest as a type of monomania, where the individual becomes fixated on a particular distressing thought or belief.
Okay, so even with this new focus on biology and the nervous system,
Yeah.
they were still trying to fit melancholia into these existing categories and frameworks.
Yeah.
It sounds like a really messy and confusing time
It was.
in the history of mental health.
It definitely was. But out of this messiness, some important trends started to emerge. And the rise of statistics in the 19th century had a profound impact on how melancholia was viewed and diagnosed.
Wait, statistics, what do numbers have to do with diagnosing mental illness?
Well, as physicians started to gather more data on patients, they began to notice patterns in the symptoms associated with melancholia. And one symptom in particular became a major focus of attention: suicidal tendencies.
Ah, so this is where we start to see the link between melancholia and the risk of suicide solidifying.
Exactly.
That makes sense. But I'm curious to hear more about how this emphasis on statistics shaped the understanding of melancholia. Did it lead to a more standardized diagnosis? Or did it create new challenges?
You know, that's a fantastic question, and it's something that we're going to unpack when we come back. We'll delve deeper into the role of statistics, the emergence of simple melancholia, and explore some fascinating case studies from the era.
I can't wait. We'll be back in a flash with more from the Mad Genius Thesis.
You know, as we were just talking about the role of statistics in how people saw melancholia, it's worth noting that this whole emphasis on data collection, it wasn't just about like counting cases, you know? It also extended to very meticulously documenting patients' behaviors and their symptoms,
Oh, okay.
especially those related to suicide.
So they weren't just interested in like how many people were diagnosed with melancholia, but the specifics of how the condition showed up.
Yeah.
Especially when it came to thoughts about suicide or suicide actions.
Exactly. And this focus on suicide, you know, it wasn't driven only by this desire for scientific understanding.
Right.
There were also very practical concerns, especially in the context of asylums.
Ah,
Remember, asylums back then were mostly focused on containment and control. So being able to identify potential risks, especially the risk of self-harm, that was like super important.
that makes sense. I mean, if you're running an asylum, you definitely want to know who might be a danger to themselves or others. But it seems like this focus on suicidal tendencies could have led to some pretty subjective judgments. I mean, how did they figure out who was really at risk?
That's where things get really, really interesting.
Okay.
Physicians were developing new tools like medical certificates of insanity, which you needed to admit someone to an asylum. And these certificates, they often had a whole section just asking about suicidal thoughts or behaviors.
Oh, so they were officially writing down those tendencies as part of the diagnosis.
Yeah.
But I mean, what even counted as a suicidal tendency? Were they looking for specific signs, or was it more about what the patients themselves said?
It was kind of both.
Okay.
And as you can probably imagine, there was a lot of variation in how those signs were interpreted by different physicians.
Oh, I bet.
Some were super focused on, verbal expressions of despair, hopelessness, even a direct threats of self-harm.
Right.
Others focus more on subtle behaviors like changes in sleep or appetite or social withdrawal.
So something as simple as like not wanting to eat or be around people could be seen as a sign of wanting to hurt yourself. It seems like a lot of people could have been labeled suicidal when they weren't actually a danger to themselves.
You're totally right to bring that up. It really highlights how dangerous it can be to over-pathologize certain behaviors, especially when those behaviors can be caused by so many different things, not just mental illness.
Yeah.
We even see this today with how we sometimes interpret and respond to expressions of sadness or distress.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good reminder that context really matters and we shouldn't jump to conclusions.
For sure.
But speaking of nuances, you mentioned earlier a subtype of melancholia called simple melancholia. What made this category so interesting?
Simple melancholia was like this puzzle for 19th century physicians. Basically, it was cases where people had profound mental anguish and despair, but they didn't have any delusions or hallucinations.
So they were super depressed, but still rational.
Yeah.
Didn't that contradict the prevailing view of melancholia as a disorder rooted in like irrational thoughts and belief?
It did, and that's why simple melancholia caused such a stir. It challenged those simple assumptions and forced physicians to rethink what emotional suffering actually was. They were trying to understand how someone who seemed totally lucid could reason and think clearly, but still be driven to such deep despair that they would think about suicide.
It does seem like a paradox. How did they explain this idea of rational suicide? Was there any agreement on what could push these people to such extremes?
Well, this is where that idea of mental pain that we talked about earlier becomes really, really important.
Okay.
Physicians started arguing that in cases of simple melancholia, the mental pain was so intense, so all-consuming, that it became like the main reason behind thinking about suicide.
Yeah.
They said this constant pain, even without distorted thinking, could just overwhelm a person's ability to think rationally and make them see death as the only way out.
It's almost like they were saying the pain itself became a delusion, like a kind of overwhelming reality that twisted their perception of the world, even though they were rational in other ways.
Yeah, that's a very sharp observation. And it shows just how radical this change in thinking was. They were moving away from seeing suicide as just an act of madness or irrationality and starting to acknowledge the immense power of emotional suffering, even in people who seemed otherwise clear-headed.
This is giving me a whole new perspective on how we understand depression today.
Yeah.
It makes you think, if this focus on mental pain in simple melancholia was an early step towards understanding the profound despair that so many people with depression feel, even if they don't have psychotic symptoms.
I think you're right there.
Yeah.
This look back in time can give us really valuable insights into how our understanding of mental health has developed. It reminds us that the categories we use to classify mental illness are always evolving, and that there's always more to learn about the complicated relationship between our minds and bodies.
For sure. Speaking of learning, you mentioned earlier that the casebooks of a 19th century psychiatrist named Thomas S. Clouston gave a fascinating glimpse into how melancholia was diagnosed and treated in practice. What can you tell us about Clouston and the insights we get from his casebooks?
Thomas S. Clouston was a big-deal Scottish psychiatrist. He worked at the Royal Edinburgh Asylum, which later became Morningside Hospital. And he was a really thorough record keeper.
Oh, wow.
And his casebooks are a goldmine of information about his patients' lives and experiences.
I'm excited to hear what his casebooks tell us. Did he agree with his colleagues about the biological basis of melancholia?
Yeah, he did. Clouston was all about the biological model of mental illness. He believed that melancholia in all its forms came from problems within the nervous system.
Okay.
But what makes his casebooks so fascinating is how they document the huge variety of behaviors and symptoms that were classified as suicidal tendencies in his patients.
Oh, interesting. So it wasn't just about people directly saying they wanted to die.
Right.
There were other more subtle things they were looking for.
Exactly. Clouston's notes show that anything from saying they felt despair and hopelessness to actively looking for ways to harm themselves, even passive behaviors like refusing to eat or withdrawing from social interaction, could be seen as evidence of suicidal tendencies.
It sounds like they were considering a lot of different things when they were judging suicide risk. Do you think this was because they didn't fully understand mental illness at the time, or was there something else going on?
I think it was a bunch of different things. Definitely there was still a lot to learn about melancholia and how suicidal behavior worked. But don't forget, asylums back then were operating under very different priorities than we have now.
Right.
Their main focus was safety and control. So identifying potential risks, even if they were based on subjective interpretations, was considered essential.
Makes sense in that context. But it also makes you think about how important it is to be aware of the historical and social factors that influence medical practices. What might have been seen as a reasonable precaution then could seem like too much or even harmful today.
Exactly. Clouston's casebooks show us a time when the lines between medical observation and social control were blurry. They remind us that even well-intentioned medical practices can be shaped by the social norms and anxieties of the time.
This whole conversation has really made me think about how much our understanding of depression has changed over time.
Yeah.
I mean, we've come a long way from diagnosing melancholia based on how someone looked and saying it was because of too much black bile. But if our views on mental illness have changed so drastically in the past, what do you think future generations might think about our approaches?
That's a really cool question to think about. I think, given what we've seen so far, it's probably safe to say that advances in neuroscience and genetics will be huge in shaping how we understand depression in the future. We might be able to find specific genes or neural pathways that cause the condition and that could lead to treatments that are more targeted and effective.
It's wild to think that we could one day have personalized medicine for mental health designed for an individual's unique genes or brain chemistry. That would be incredible.
Yeah.
But I also hope that as we learn more about the biology of depression, we don't forget about the psychological and social factors that are also a part of mental well-being.
Right.
It's not just about brain chemicals, it's about seeing the whole person.
I totally agree. The biopsychosocial model, which recognizes how biological, psychological, and social factors all play a part in mental health, has been so important.
Yeah.
And as we move forward, it'll be key to keep this holistic view.
It's all about realizing how complex the human experience really is.
Yeah.
We can't simplify mental illness down to a formula or a set of biological markers.
Right.
And this brings us back to the main theme of this podcast, the connection between creativity and mental illness.
Right.
We've talked a lot about melancholia today, but how does all this connect to creativity?
That's a question that deserves its own deep dive for sure.
Yeah.
But I think a key takeaway from our conversation today is this. The same sensitivities, the same intense emotions that can cause mental anguish can also power creative expression. It's a double-edged sword. The same fire that can burn you can also light up the world.
Wow, that's a beautiful way to put it. It speaks to the fact that the human mind can experience both great suffering and incredible creativity. Maybe by understanding how our view of conditions like melancholia has evolved over time, we can better appreciate the complexity and the potential of the human mind.
Exactly. And while we've made a lot of progress in understanding depression, there's still so much we don't know. There's always more to explore, more to discover, and more to learn.
Definitely. Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this awesome exploration of melancholia and its lasting impact. Thank you for joining us on the Mad Genius Thesis. If you want to learn more about this topic, be sure to check out Åsa Jansson's book, From Melancholia to Depression. It's a deep dive into this fascinating historical journey. Until next time, keep exploring. Keep asking questions and keep embracing the complexities of the human mind. It's pretty amazing, right? How much our view of depression has changed over time.
It really is.
I mean, we've come such a long way from diagnosing melancholia based on just looking at someone
Right.
and saying it was from too much black bile.
Uh-huh.
But, if our views on mental illness have changed this much in the past, what do you think future generations will think of our approaches?
That's a really fascinating question. I think given the path we've seen so far, it's probably safe to say that advances in neuroscience and genetics, those are going to be huge in shaping how we understand depression in the future.
Yeah.
We might even be able to find specific genes or neural pathways that actually contribute to the condition. And that could lead to treatments that are way more targeted and way more effective.
It's mind-blowing to think that we could one day have personalized medicine for mental health.
Yeah.
Like designed for each person's unique genes or their brain chemistry.
Yeah.
That would be amazing.
That would be revolutionary.
Yeah. But I also really hope that as we learn more about the biology of depression, we don't forget about the psychological and social factors that are part of mental well-being.
Absolutely.
It's not just about brain chemicals. It's about understanding the whole person.
Right. Right. I completely agree. The biopsychosocial model, which takes into account biological, psychological, and social factors in mental health, has been a really crucial step forward.
Yeah.
And as we move forward, it's going to be essential to keep that holistic perspective.
I think so too. It's all about recognizing how complex the human experience really is.
Sure.
We can't just boil mental illness down to a formula or a set of biological markers. And, this kind of brings us back to the main theme of our show.
Yeah.
The connection between creativity and mental illness.
Yes.
We've been talking about melancholia a lot today, but how does all of this relate to creativity?
That's a great question. And, that deserves its own deep dive for sure. But I think one really important takeaway from what we talked about today is this: the same sensitivities, the same intense emotions that can sometimes lead to mental anguish. Those can also fuel creative expression. It's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
The same fire that can burn you can also light up the world.
I love that. That's a beautiful way to put it. And it speaks to the idea that the human mind can experience both great suffering and incredible creativity. And maybe by understanding how our views of these conditions like melancholia have changed over time, we can better appreciate the complexity and the potential of the human mind.
Exactly. And even though we've made such amazing progress in understanding depression, there's still so much we don't know. There's always more to explore, more to discover, more to learn.
I agree. Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our exploration of melancholia and its impact. Thanks for joining us on the Mad Genius Thesis. If you want to go deeper into this, be sure to check out Åsa Jansson's book, From Melancholia to Depression. It's a deep dive into this fascinating history. And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep embracing the complexities of the human mind.